some even hinting at US involvement. Will an interim government be able to fill Bolivia's political power vacuum and quell the unrest? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the ouster of Evo Morales. One of the latest photos of Evo Morales shows him on board a plane, alone, en route to self-imposed exile, looking forlorn and holding the Mexican flag. Just days earlier, during his televised resignation, the embattled president of Bolivia declared himself the victim of a coup, telling viewers his only sin was being indigenous, a trade unionist and a coca grower. Then, quoting a Peruvian revolutionary, Morales promised, "We will return and we will be millions." His supporters say he was a champion of the poor who rebuilt the country's fledgling economy. His detractors accused him of being an autocrat, dead set on ruling beyond mandated limits, whose hubris plunged Bolivia into a political crisis. We'll ask whether or not that return to power Morales so boldly envisions is ever likely to happen. But first, Adam Pletz reports on how Latin America's longest-serving leader let go of the reins of power.
On Sunday, Evo Morales resigned as president of Bolivia, a decision apparently triggered by the police, army and other institutions ending their support for him.
To my brothers and sisters of Bolivia, the whole world, I want to inform you from Loca, I'm here with the Vice President and Minister of Health, that after listening to my friends at the Social Movement Federation, the Bolivian Workers' Center and the Catholic Church, I have decided to resign my position as president.
Morales has called his removal a coup and accepted political asylum in Mexico. Some protesters are celebrating his resignation, but his departure has also led to fighting in the streets of La Paz.
It is very important that the police and the armed forces do not give an impression that there are actions of revenge and intimidation taking place, that there are no threats of imprisonment against the Movement to Socialism senators.
Left-wing leaders across Latin America have expressed their support for Morales.
El ejército de Bolivia pidió la renuncia del presidente.
The Bolivian army requested the resignation of the president, and President Evo Morales decided to submit his resignation to avoid a civil war. Therefore, it's a coup, because the army requested the resignation of the president.
But right-wing politicians say his departure is a victory for the Bolivian people.
I am hoping for a peaceful and quick transition that will lead to a presidential election. Indeed, it was the great demand of Bolivians in the streets. They were together, united, demanding a transition, that the government leave due to the fraud.
The Washington-based Organization of American States says it found evidence of manipulation in Morales' recent electoral victory. It's an accusation his government denied. According to the Bolivian constitution, new presidential elections should take place within 90 days. Opposition lawmaker and Senate Vice President Janine Áñez has become interim president. Morales says he will return with more strength and energy. But was his removal the result of popular democracy expressed on the streets? Or was he forced out by a coup? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from one of Bolivia's capitals, La Paz, is Raul Penaranda, a journalist and author accused by Morales' government of working against it for his strong stance on press freedom. Also with us is Olivia Arigho Stiles. She's a Latin American studies researcher at the University of Essex, focusing on indigenous movements in Bolivia. And in Liverpool, we have Marieke Riethof. She's a senior lecturer in Latin American politics at the University of Liverpool. Good to have you all on the program. Raul, was it a coup?
Thank you, Imran, for having me. I don't think that it was a coup. What Bolivia saw was 3 weeks of unrest, 3 weeks of protests. I think it is an insult for millions of Bolivians that went to the streets to protest against Morales to say that this was a coup. I think that Morales lost his base. He lost the majority of his support. He couldn't come to La Paz. I cannot understand how a president could govern without being able to come to the seat of government. So yes, I think that it was not a coup. It was a protest, a revolt, and that forced him to go to out of power.
Olivia, doesn't Raul make a good point when he says that it takes away from the agency of the hundreds of thousands of people who took to the streets against him by calling it a coup? What about those people who were against him for wanting to extend his term limits, for rejecting their questions over the election?
Yes, it was absolutely a coup. It is also true that there was a lot of mass protest against Morales for the reasons you have outlined, namely the running again after a referendum which said he shouldn't. But we've seen the mass mobilization here of a particularly hardcore ultra-right set of conservatives, particularly from the city of Santa Cruz. What we've also seen is, at the same time, mass mobilization for Evo Morales. Now, I've been in the La Paz the whole time here, and Evo Morales absolutely was here. I saw him speak in Plaza San Francisco. So it's certainly not the case that there was mobilization from one side. This was a highly fraught, highly tense situation, and it was absolutely a coup. The military, it was only when the military on Sunday suggested that Morales should resign that he was forced to do so. That's a military coup.
So, Marieke, is the claim that it was a coup, I guess, more accurate and more justified when we look at the fact that the man said, I want to have another rerun of the election, and the military forced him out using the threat of force?
Well, what was surprising to me was that the offer of new elections wasn't necessarily welcomed by the opposition to Morales. I think elections under international monitoring would have solved a lot of issues. And it seems that the opposition is trying to negotiate that Morales does not run again. So to come back to the question of whether it is a coup or not, in this case, the military's commentary on the political situation is very problematic. And ideally, in a situation like this, you would see a president finishing his or her term and new elections held.
Raul, the last time we spoke, we all said we were waiting for the OAS's recommendations. They came out, they said, yes, there were clear manipulations in that election, and they suggested a rerun. The man came out and said, okay, I'm open to that. So why wasn't that enough? Couldn't that have been a more preferred path for Bolivian politics?
Look, the majority of the people was really trying to get Morales out of power. So when he offered new elections, it was not enough for the people. When the OAS said that it was fraud, manipulated by whom? By Morales. So the person that made that fraud wanted to run again. So the protesters thought that that was impossible to accept that. And the only possibility was to have elections without him. And finally, I think that's the thing that's going to happen.
Raul, nested in the protest movement, nested within the opposition, is Olivia right that there is an element of racism, classism, and people who just hated the fact that they had an indigenous leader?
It is correct. It is right that we have a racist society and a classist society. It is sad to say that in 14 years of Morales' government, we didn't get rid of that. It is true. But also it's true that Morales also played in a very irresponsible way the race card. But yes, we have a racist society. What's the percentage of the protesters that are racists? We don't know. Maybe it's a minority, but it is true that they exist.
Olivia, maybe it's a minority. Is Raul too hopeful?
Well, it's certainly true that we've seen a disturbing resurgence of the kind of racism that many thought had been consigned to the past. And this has developed alongside the mobilization of this opposition movement. That's not to say that everyone in the opposition is a racist, but that the opposition movement clearly carries very dangerous messaging that has encouraged the kind of racist discourse that we've seen. Just outside the public university, UMSA, I was walking past on the 29th of October. I saw Indios fuera de la UMSA, Indians out of UMSA. We've seen video footage of the Huifala, a flag representing indigenous peoples in Bolivia and Latin America, burned on the streets. Footage of armed police tearing off the Huifala from their uniform. I think it is absolutely clear that we have seen that there are very dangerous elements in the opposition movement which have given rise to this kind of racist resurgence.
With that in mind, Marieke, are you worried about what comes next? Because you have people who support Morales who are adamant that this was a coup, and you have others on the other side who are either tinged with or, in many ways, according to the likes of Olivia, they are dominated by racist types. With that in mind, might it get ugly?
Well, we have already seen problems of police violence between different groups, both supporting and opposing Morales. My reading of the situation is that Bolivia has become very polarized, which is also reflected in both the election results and in the opposition and support for Morales. What is very worrying is that indigenous rights have become a symbol of the opposition to Morales, in the sense that they have become an object of hatred, of racism. And in that perspective, I worry about the position of indigenous people, whether the expansion of indigenous rights will continue or whether Bolivia will take a step back.
So I wonder, that's an interesting point. So Raul, I wonder, when we look at the different players here, so we have the deputy leader of the Senate, Janine Áñez Chávez, who's currently in charge for the interim. We have the protest leader, Luis Fernando Camacho, the former President Carlos Mesa, who ran against Morales and said he won the election. With all of them in mind, can indigenous Bolivians trust them to ensure that they can still have their rights as equal citizens?
I don't think that those leaders really represent the thinking and the thoughts of these indigenous groups. I think that, but we're going to have elections in 3 months. We're going to have elections in 3 months or maybe 4 months. And the MAS party, the party of the former President Morales, is going to have a candidate. It's not going to be him, of course, because he's out of the country, but the MAS is going to have a candidate. And so the indigenous population, peasants and poor people that supported Morales can, of course, vote for another candidate.
Olivia, you want to fight the system, fight them at the polls in 3 months? Do you accept that?
Well, I think what we've actually seen is threats against the MAS. Officials have had their houses burnt down. There's been a campaign of intimidation and reprisals against MAS leaders and their supporters. So that's why I'm quite worried about what the future might hold, because the opposition really is seeking nothing less than the annihilation of the MAS in Bolivian political life. So as for whether who will be protecting the rights of indigenous peoples, of campesinos, it remains yet to be seen.
And so I want us to have a little look at a Morales tweet recently. We've translated it from the Spanish. He said, "Sisters and brothers, I leave for Mexico grateful for the generosity of the government, of the fraternal people who gave us asylum. to take care of ourselves. It hurts me to leave the country for political reasons, but I will always be ready. Soon I will return with more strength and energy. Marieke, you said this has polarized Bolivia. Arguably, it has polarized Latin America and even the world, as the news has broken over the past couple of days. And we're seeing the geopolitical battle lines drawn. So the Mexicans are saying, okay, we'll take care of you. The Argentines come in and condemn it. We've had Russia say it's a coup. And we have the United States and Brazil and Colombia and others who say it's not a coup and this is good news, right? How is this going to reshuffle geopolitical alliances or re-emphasize geopolitical alliances when it comes to Latin America? Marieke?
Yes, so it's very interesting to see which Latin American leaders immediately stepped up to condemn the coup, and others, of course, celebrated it as a victory for democracy, such as Bolsonaro in Brazil. So I see a new alliance emerging there between countries that support a more return towards leftist government in Latin America, but also a hardening of the position of countries such as Brazil. And that can also be a worrying situation in the terms of Brazil's close economic relations to Bolivia. So Brazil's dependency on Bolivian gas is very important. So Brazil clearly has a stake in what is going to happen in Bolivia. And I expect Bolsonaro's position to be problematic because he clearly supports what has happened and also new elections. But that could lead to a situation where Bolivia has a government which is less supportive of indigenous rights.
Right. Raul, how do you feel about that? The fact that people superimpose pre-existing ideological models on what's happening here. So you have those who say, well, thank God this is the death of Bolivarianism and the left and so on. And there are others who are saying, you see, this is just yet another example of the right wing resurging and knocking out any decent leader who wants to take care of the poor in our region. How do you feel about that as a Bolivian?
It is very interesting that in general, the left in Europe and the left in the US and Canada, they think that this is a coup. And they think that this was a very unfair way of treating Morales. Of course, that sentiment is also in Latin America, for example, in Argentina and Mexico. But in general, the region, our neighbors, are not really saying that this was a coup. Last night, when Morales had to go to Mexico in his plane, Peru and Ecuador didn't allow the plane to go through their airspace. And those are not right-wing countries, extreme right, like Vizcarra in Peru, Moreno in Ecuador. And they allow the plane to go through their airspace. This is for one reason. It's because Morales was an authoritarian leader that wanted to stay in power forever. And but of course, the left in the U.S. and in Europe and in England, they're saying that this is a coup. But in the region where they are closer and they understand better what is going on, they say that this is not a coup. This was a revolt, a popular revolt against a president that wanted to stay in power forever.
Olivia, when Peru and Ecuador said that they don't want his plane to fly through their airspace, are they just acting as agents of imperialism, or are they, as Raul says, just judging the situation based on its merits and not on ideology?
No, I mean, I think both Peru and Ecuador, neither of which would be described in any way as a left-wing regime. Of course, in Ecuador, we've seen massive protests, certainly not in Ecuador's interests to express any sympathy with a socialist president such as Morales. I think whether countries both in the region and internationally describe it as a coup largely depends on where they kind of fit in the political compass. We've seen Mexico, Argentina, both now under left-wing governments, express solidarity and support for Morales. So I think it very much depends on kind of the political sort of where these states fall.
Okay, Olivia, does it help or harm the situation?
I think it absolutely helps. We have to. It is vital that countries stand up and call out what has happened. It is a coup, and therefore it is right that they provide solidarity.
Right, Raul, I want to sort of step back for a second and just look at the man's legacy. I know he wants to come back, but at the moment he's landing in Mexico, and for all intents and purposes, he's no longer ever going to be the leader of Bolivia. I want to look a bit at his legacy. Now, let's take the alleged slide towards authoritarianism aside, right? Wanting, removing term limits, ignoring the referendum, wanting to be president for longer than a lot of people would have wanted him to be. When we look at the economy, this is hardly a Venezuela. He didn't wreck the economy. He grew the economy. When I look at the chart during his time in office, the GDP per capita just increased and increased and increased by sort of 1.5 times, right? With all of that in mind, didn't he bring prosperity to Bolivia, or relative prosperity, and brought a lot of people out of poverty?
Imran, that's right, totally right. He was a good president at the beginning. He was a very good leader, an important leader. This is an indigenous country, and it was good to have an indigenous president. More than half, or maybe half of the population in Bolivia are indigenous. And he was a very important leader in that sense. Also, the economy was good. We grew, and poverty went down. But that is true. It's not enough.
Oh, you got stuck there for a second, Raul. You said that. Okay, you're back. Please continue your point. You said it's true, it's not enough, and please pick up on your point there, Raul. Okay, Raul's frozen for a second. I'm going to ask Marieke to pick up on that point. Raul, an opponent of Morales, right? Admitting and at least conceding that the man grew the economy and brought a lot of people out of poverty. So I guess my question to you, Marieke, is, was that worth the treatment? After everything he had done, did he deserve the treatment of being kicked out of his country?
Yeah, one of the key questions in the protests and commentary on the Bolivian situations is whether what he did do right warrants his being able to finish his term, or perhaps even run in the next elections. My sense of it is that a lot of the debate is about agreeing or disagreeing with his policies, which in my view shouldn't be a basis on which leaders should be removed. Of course, the question of his slide towards authoritarianism is important here too. In terms of his legacy, I think the Bolivian constitution is a major legacy, because it does ensure that indigenous people are better able to participate in politics, less excluded than they were before.
Right.
And there's more respect for indigenous languages and cultures.
Yeah, and I'm thoroughly annoyed that Raul didn't get the chance to finish his point there, because we've lost his Skype connection, and we've got a minute and a half left on the program. But I think we got the gist of what he was saying just before he was about to sort of turn and say, well, the man shouldn't have been in office for much longer. Olivia, with all of that in mind, he did well for a long time, and then a lot of people, you would concede, turned against him and went onto the streets because they didn't like the fact that he ignored the referendum. They didn't like the fact that there were question marks over the election. So as we look at it now with the benefit of hindsight, did he mess up in the past couple of years by trying to cling on to power? And did he, in a way, damage his positive legacy that lasted for more than a decade?
I think there are certainly mistakes that have been made by Morales and the MAS. The failure to cultivate a successor is one of them. But I think what we need to do here is understand the latest developments, the coup, as actually a response in some ways precisely to the very success of Morales, to the elevation of indigenous peoples in public life, to the massive reduction in inequality in society, reduction in poverty. And this generated a lot of hostility from traditional sectors of opposition, namely the city of Santa Cruz, home to agribusiness elites, a traditional heartland of anti-Morales sentiment, where when he was initially elected as president, there were assassination attempts. So actually, yeah, it's important to see that there was a lot of hostility generated to the huge social gains that Morales made for the poor, for Indigenous, for women in society.
It's been really good getting all your perspectives. It is a moving story. There is a power vacuum in Bolivia. We're following it very closely. Olivia, Marieke, and Raul as well. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.